We're delighted to have Dr. Fozia Bora with us today. She's an Associate Professor of Islamic History at the University of Leeds and chairs the British Association of Islamic Studies. She's a trustee of the Gibb Memorial Trust and she's acclaimed for her engagement with historical texts and public scholarship. Dr. Bora's work, particularly her book, Writing History in the Medieval Islamic World, highlights the role of chronicles as historical archives. Her current research examines the narratives of Bradford's Muslim communities, exploring themes of migration, acculturation and settlement. Her academic contributions are aimed at enriching public understanding of Islamic history and making historical discourse accessible and relevant. Dr. Fozia Bora, it's such an honour to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Bora, how do you perceive the role of cultural and religious diversity in strengthening societal bonds in your field of expertise?
So part of the role of historians like me who are based in universities is to teach our students and to conduct research. But one of the lesser known dimensions of that work is to make that history available to communities and to tell a different kind of story about the past, to tell a less monocultural story and to show how our histories are interconnected and to pursue kind of archival and other kinds of threads of evidence to evidence that kind of connected past that we all have, but we don't appreciate enough in the present day.
Definitely, we kind of miss those links and those interplay and the interaction. We kind of ignore that, but you know, how important is it to draw that out for us today?
I think it's critical because if we think about where we're positioned in society, we often have, in our cityscapes in particular, we have many languages spoken, societies that are stratified through class, through race, through gender, through other kinds of means, but also through wealth. In some ways, our history telling has been siloed, so that history is told for particular communities, and we have a so-called national history, which I think does not give us that textured, nuanced understanding of how our cities come to be what they are now. And Bradford's a prime example of that. This city has an incredibly rich, dynamic past, but to which many communities have contributed, and part of my role is to bring out some of those stories of communities whose past has been overlooked, whose contributions have been overlooked. So I think it's very important in the moment today to bring out those stories, appreciate their kind of connection with the larger picture as well.
Absolutely crucial. Your work is so fascinating. And in your experience, what are the most effective strategies for challenging stereotypes about Muslims and Islam?
Yeah, so I think there are several ways you can go about weaving together a more complex, nuanced narrative around how we come to be in the moment we are now. As a medieval historian, I've looked at how historians of the Islamic past would write chronicles and other kinds of works, geographical works and works in various genres, not through a sectarian lens and not through a prejudicial, narrow, self-interested lens, but with a very broad understanding of what knowledge is, what history is, what culture is. And there's a lot of inspiration to be taken from that. So for example, I focused on an Egyptian historian who lived near the River Nile and he produced a multi-volume universal chronicle. He takes sources from every possible language, every possible sectarian kind of background. When I say sectarian, they were not thinking in sectarian terms. We apply those labels looking back. So the idea of Sunni history or Shia history was unknown to them in the sense that they brought all of that together. Christian sources, sources from the Latin East, Arabic sources, Persian sources, all of these things came together. So moving forward now to the present day, there's a lot we can do to have that same broad-minded understanding of the past, trying to bring the stories together, bring the languages together, bring the source materials together. So my work has been focused on the medieval past, but moving more towards the modern past, because that I think speaks to where Bradford is now as a colonial global city, but also a city with its own unique identity in the Yorkshire landscape.
So interesting how you are looking at the fragmentation really of knowledge that's kind of happened, but it wasn't something that was in the past, but do you feel it's now emerging now?
Yeah. So what's really interesting is that we tend to look at the past and think that the past was a more divided society and we are much more unified and together. I mean, I say that, you know, we are in a moment of, we've had Brexit and we've had other divisive issues, of course, but on the whole, we tend to think of the past as less progressive, let's say, less tolerant. that's actually overturned when you look at the evidence. You find societies, and the medieval Islamic world is a prime example of this, where religions did rub along much better than they do together today, where people of different religious backgrounds work together much more closely, and they had a shared culture. And that shared culture, I think, can only be nurtured, recreated, cultivated through an understanding of the history as being something to which communities contribute in different kinds of ways. So to go back to your question, you can approach that history through the academic lens, but also through art, through storytelling, through performance. So part of my work now is to work on the history of Bradford through artistic interpretation. So we look at photographs and we juxtapose them with photographs about Bradfordians today, and we look at the differences and we look at the similarities. Where do we see parallels between Bradfordians in the early modern period and Bradfordians now? So, there are different ways to engage people in those different histories and bring them together to do so.
Fascinating. I really want to ask you so many more questions about this, because it's just fascinating how you're kind of modelling what we had in medieval Islamic past to today,
Right.
and it can apply to today, and even the Enlightenment as
Right.
well, and the interplay between the Muslim world and Europe was
Right.
actually a lot more pronounced than we might think. Like people like John Locke were influenced by Islamic thinkers.
Absolutely.
So that is very interesting, that interplay.
It is absolutely. So the interplay between the kind of so-called Islamic world and so-called West, there are different ways in which to approach it. And we've had some really good work showing the Islamic roots of the European Enlightenment, and many sort of scholars have worked on this. One of the interesting things is that some of the conflicts between Islam and the West are viewed very differently. If you look at Arab scholarship versus Western scholarship, the Crusades is an example of this. The Crusades is one kind of episode of conflict where it's told through the lens of military incursion, through a kind of the lens of war and of settlement and colonialism in some senses. But it's also a story of cross-cultural interaction, of Westerners coming to the East, learning a great deal and bringing that back with them in what was thought to be a kind of dark ages in Europe. So in many ways, these stories of interaction between the West and the East need to be told very differently, looking at Arabic sources, looking at Persian sources, looking at Armenian, Syriac, and other Eastern sources. You get a very different picture. So I think it's very important that we historians look at this material, bring it to the public, and tell new and dynamic stories around them. And I think it actually affects people's sense of their identity and their sense of the other. And the other becomes less other once you are familiar with these different stories and these different ways of interpreting the past.
And Dr. Bora, what initiatives or projects are you involved in that align with the aims of the Islam and Muslims initiatives that foster intercultural understanding and cooperation?
So part of my work is at the Leeds University's Institute for Medieval Studies, which I direct at the moment. And the thrust of my work there in the last year has been to move us from an excellent but Eurocentric curriculum where Latin is the gateway to the past, the medieval past, to a situation where we have much more multicultural approach, where we have Arabic, Persian and other languages involved, but also we look at how the medieval past was conceived differently by different communities, and the very term medieval is quite a Eurocentric term. So part of my work has been to globalize the curriculum, to make it less Eurocentric, to include other strands of thinking. So that's one part of my work. The other part is that I am chair of the British Association for Islamic Studies, and we have an annual conference and we have workshops and we have various initiatives and a prize. And that also has been an endeavour to bring in many more voices, many more historical and other kinds of narratives, to create a kind of meta discourse that pushes the idea that we are many and our stories are many and there are many connections between them, and that I think helps us to think about Islam's place in the world today through a very different kind of lens. And I think it helps our members and our academic researchers and our community members to appreciate that telling the story of the past in different kinds of ways is not just valid but critical, and that I think helps them to feel a part of a bigger conversation. So I do work at the University of Leeds and also work outside it, and part of my kind of desire has been also to work outside of academia. So I talk at schools, I talk on Muslim community platforms and in mosques about Islamic history, trying to tell these different kinds of stories about the past.
Well, your work is crucial and so fascinating. Thank you so much for that. And given your expertise in Islamic history and your current research on Bradford's Muslim communities, how do you envision your work contributing to the Islam and Muslims initiative in their goals of fostering a deeper understanding of Muslim histories and experiences in global context?
That's a great question. So my current project is called A Somali Village in Colonial Bradford. And it's a fascinating story. It's the story of a group of Somalis that came to Bradford in 1904 as part of an exhibition to put forward a model village of displaying their culture, basically. And it sounds incredibly disturbing to think about human beings being brought over to display their culture in that way, in the kind of model of a so-called human zoo. But actually, you dig into the stories of the Somalis. They're multicultural, they're multilingual, they're great travelers, they're entrepreneurs. So my project is about showing how this community of Somalis speaks to the story of migration into this city and the impact that migrants have had in building up an understanding of Bradford as a global city in the early modern and modern period, a city where many cultures have found their home. We don't ignore the racialization aspect, the aspect of colonial inequality or prejudice, discrimination, and they're all part of the story. But there's a much more dynamic story there of how this community came with things to sell, ideas to put forward. They came here and they did da'wah, they did missionary work to the Bradford public. So it's a very interesting story of how you can turn the tables on a conventional narrative of what migrants bring to the city if you look into their stories more deeply, if you look at the photographs they left behind, if you look at the archival threads and the oral narratives that tell us their history in a different kind of way.
That is fascinating. I want to look further into that project. So thank you so much, Dr. Fozia Bora, for your time. It's just been such an honour and pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely. Thank you.